Party 1019. The new Party 1019. New York's #1 for throwbacks.
Thank you for taking the time to join us today. If you're just tuning in or logging in or downloading, my name is Michael W. Ray, and this is the Sidebar, the podcast of the New York Association of Black Journalists. And today, it's rare that I'm tongue-tied, but my goodness, there's no words at the current moment. I want to make sure I give exceptional, exceeding amount of thanks in the last minute for accommodating me. DWI, DSN, the Nexus Studios. Greatly appreciate the cut in the scheduling book to accommodate me. Let us get right to it. My two guests today are here on behalf of promoting a fabulous book titled Deeper Blues. And I would like to tell you that this book is about the life, the songs, straight from the press release, the life, the songs, and salvation of Cornbread Harris, James Cornbread Harris. So now if you're sitting over wherever you are and you're like, James Harris, no, or you do like most people I've mentioned it to, that are like, well, no, I know Jimmy Jam Harris, right? But I don't is there another James Harris? Well, we wouldn't have a Jimmy Jam without the gentleman that this book is there so about Cornbread, James Cornbread Harris. We have the author, Ms. Andrea Swensson, and of course, subject matter professional in this matter, James Jimmy Jam Harris III. Thank the both of you for your time today. Let's get right to it. What prompted this book to come about?
Well, I can start with that because I had met Jimmy and I'd also met his father, Cornbread, through my work in the Minneapolis music scene. I've been a journalist there for the past 20 years. And it was 2021 that I got a text message from Jimmy letting me know that he was going to be in town. And he asked if I might help him get in touch with his father. And I had known a little bit about their relationship, but not the full extent of it. And I said, of course, and I hooked him up with someone that could arrange a meeting between the two of them. And then a couple days later, I got another text message with a picture of Jimmy and Cornbread and Jimmy's son, Max, all together. And he said, I just wanted to say thanks for setting up that meeting. That was the first time I'd spoken to Cornbread in 35 years, which was a jaw-dropping text message to receive. I think I cried about it for the rest of that day. And I thought, what an extraordinary moment in these men's lives, and what extraordinary men. And they had individually had such fascinating lives and careers, and I knew right away that I wanted to do something. So I went and met with Cornbread, and I said, I'd like to research and write a book about you. I think your story is worthy of it, and I think what's happening in this moment of you being reconnected to your son is so powerful. And that started this now 3.5-year journey of us being in each other's lives and me researching both of their lives, but especially Cornbread's, and writing this book.
What has it meant to you to see basically this come full circle? I know you have a period of time that you haven't spoke from previous interviews of yours that I've thoroughly researched before I even knew I was going to interview you, right? I understand that he might not have been able to pursue music the way he wanted to when you were a young man, right? And I believe your mom pressed him to, Jimmy, we got Jimmy.
Yes.
Jimmy, I can't have you running around, going to come back with $200 when, right? So what has it meant to you to see this come together at this time?
Well, I always say, the words God's plan. And this was truly God's plan. And you're right. I mean, I remember growing up, and I obviously had my musical talent came from my dad. I think my musical appreciation came from my mom. And growing up in the house, there was always records, there was always keyboards around the house, there was always instruments around the house. So I grew up very immersed in music. But there was a certain point where, probably when I was around 9 or 10 years old, where I remember my parents arguing all the time about, my dad had actually, I think I was maybe 11 years old, I went to the studio with him. He made a record that was beginning to get a little bit of airplay and stuff. And he wanted to go tour, behind this record. And he was at a point where he could take like 3 months off from work and still just walk right back into his job. And I remember my mom going, "No, you said you were going to give up music and you were going to, work a regular job and raise your son." And, I remember her saying that, and I used to argue about it every night, literally. And I remember in my mind, I'm thinking, give up music? That's like giving up oxygen. Like, how could you possibly do that? And so in my mind, I was like, I'm never getting married and I'm never having kids. Because even at that point, I knew that music was going to be part of my life, and I didn't want that. So the interesting thing was one day I remember my dad going to work, and he just never came back. And so it was kind of me and my mom just kind of figuring it out. And a couple of years later, I decided I was going to quit high school because I just felt like it was not leading me to where I wanted to be. And I said to her, I'm going to drop out of school. And I thought she was going to hit the ceiling. And she said, okay. She said, as long as I see you really working towards what it is that you want to do. And I always thought that was really weird. About 5 years later, maybe, I remember Terry and I got nominated for Producer of the Year at the Grammys. I brought my mom as my date. When we won, even though my mom didn't get to see me graduate high school, she got to watch me walk across the Grammy stage with a Grammy in my hand, and that was my graduation, basically. So fast forward now to a few years back, and somebody said to me, "Do you think that the reason your mom let you follow your dream was because she didn't let your dad follow his dream?" And at that moment, I knew I need to let him know, because I realized he had basically sacrificed his dream for me. And I needed to let him know that I felt no resentment, no bitterness, I didn't feel any of that towards him. But I wanted to lift, if he had any guilt about leaving, I wanted to lift that from him. I just wanted to let him know. And that was started my quest towards trying to reconnect with him and just to let him know that. And that's where Andrea came into it and really kind of forged the path, along with some other circumstances, but she kind of forged the path of kind of planting the seeds of putting us back together again. And a lot of that gets talked about in the book, which is what's so amazing about it.
Andrea, as you were putting this book together, tell me the range of emotions that ran as you gathered information and fact-checked. And, I know that I've written a half a magazine article like 15 years ago. That's my my journalistic foray. But I know there's that point where you sit and look at everything you have just to make sure that what you have is what you have.
Yes.
As you were going through those paces, tell me about the emotions that ran with you as you looked at your facts and put it together.
This has been an extremely emotional project from start to finish. I mean, the beginning of it was so astonishing. Watching Jimmy and Cornbread share space together again has been very moving, and the ways that they've gradually re-entered each other's lives. And so the whole process, whether I was in a microfilm room looking for newspaper clippings, or whether I was facilitating a Zoom conversation between father and son, it's been very, very moving. I also wrote most of the book while pregnant, so that was also emotional.
Okay, emotional.
Yes.
Yes, to say the least.
Yes. And I really struggled when I sat down to actually write with how to frame the story, because I at first did not see myself as being part of it. I really wanted it to be very focused on Cornbread because it's his life, and also focused on Jimmy. But when I started writing it from kind of a detached place, it just didn't feel right. And I realized that I wanted to invite people into this whole experience because it's been so human and profound in so many ways. So I started writing in the first person about meeting them and getting thrown into the middle of their lives, and how this has gradually unfolded over time. And when I started doing that, it just really started flowing and made sense to have it be part historical nonfiction, part almost memoir, but it's still very focused on these two gentlemen.
I think, having perused it online, I think that's the one thing that stood out to me. Like, how did she manage to grasp multiple perspectives in one write. Like it's okay, there's a point where as a reader you're saying, okay, this is biographical, but then there's enough of your own, what I feel to be your own sentiment that, well, is this kind of autobiographical and they're a part of her life at a certain point, and then there's the fact part, right?
Yes.
That is just, you know, undeniable. There's the educational aspect. People, no disrespect, but I mean, for most of us, no one, you know, knew of your father and what he had, what his contribution is to the greater aspect of music. So
Right.
as you look at it, or as you take what I just said, what thoughts go through your mind when you realize that, at least to me, ladies and gentlemen, I know this is not a paid sponsor, right? But to me, this may very well be one of the top 15 books of the last 25 years.
Oh my.
Wow.
Just in the method and the feeling of books. Reading music, entertainment is supposed to take you somewhere. I think I read 15 pages, spread a little in the beginning, a little in the middle, a little in the back, and I was ready to go to sleep. I was tired. Not that the book was boring, so please no one think I'm saying the book is boring. But what I'm saying is that you moved the reader in so many different directions.
Yes.
So when you hear that, this is a masterpiece. I'd say this whether you were here, sir, or not. This is a masterpiece. This is a master class in how to mix emotions with facts and tell a story. So when you hear stuff like that, because I'm quite sure you've heard stuff like that similar, maybe not all in one place, but I don't know the next time this opportunity gonna come around, so I got to get it out, right? When you hear stuff like that about your work as a writer in your 20 years, a podcaster, everything you've done to the, you know, observer of the music scene, how does that make you feel?
I mean, wow. I definitely am so proud of this work. I do feel like it's kind of a high point for me of, you know, the last 20 years has been leading to me being able to offer something like this to the world. You're reminding me of the first time I started reading some of the book to Cornbread. And then Jimmy heard I was reading it to Cornbread, and he said, well, I want to hear you read this book. So then we got him on Zoom, and I read a whole chapter out loud to both of them with my voice shaking like crazy because I was so nervous about what they were going to think. I mean, this is their lives. And there was kind of a silence at the end, and Cornbread was crying, and I was crying. And Jimmy just said, you've got those facts with feeling. You put the feeling on the facts.
Yes.
And I thought that was just such a beautiful way to summarize my work and also just the story. I mean, it's required a lot of rigorous research. I've spent a lot of hours with Cornbread. I did over 100 interviews with him for this book, 40 interviews with him and Jimmy together, and then many countless hours in libraries. But I didn't want it to feel like, you know, a dry biography. Like it is an extremely moving story and powerful, and everyone that we tell it to is so moved. We've seen this response from people where they say, this reminds me of this relationship that I have going on in my life. And it gives me hope, and it inspires me to reach out to someone I haven't talked to in a while, or to process a loss. So I think that there's just so much humanity in it. And I'm really proud to hear that that's coming across.
Sir, you, in a previous interview that I heard, mentioned how this is when your mom became your agent for a few minutes, when you played drums for your dad.
Yes.
Finally played drums for your dad, where he finally let it go. Looking back at that, I know you were young, but looking back at that, how was watching your dad, performing with your dad, how has that shaped what we've been listening to? Because you, sir, have scored my life. Let's just call it like it is. If my life is a motion picture, as well as countless other people, which is why the Billboard Awards and the Grammys and the nominations, and probably, I know you are, the first Rock and Roll Hall of Famer to grace this studio. Clearly the first that I've interviewed, right? So how much of time with Dad early has influenced how you make your music and how you put feeling in your music?
Well, it was influenced totally by him, because he taught me. It was interesting, the parallels, because he was the one that taught me very simply when I was first learning to try to play the piano a little bit. the difference between a major seventh chord, a minor seventh chord, a seventh chord, all of those little things. And he gave me just the kind of basics of that and said, this is how you play this chord, this is how you play this chord. So I always had that. I had a natural good ear. My mom played, records all day. So I was just immersed in such a great kind of music education, if you will. And then I used to go watch my dad play. And I'd go, and he played in multiple bands. That was a funny thing. He had his own band, which was called Huckleberry Finn, Cornbread and Friends.
Okay.
And then he played with a couple of other, bands that were local bands. And I used to go to every rehearsal. When he went to the recording studio, I'd go to the recording studio. I just loved being around the music, and I loved being around him playing the music. And I think it gave me my whole musical education, my whole music appreciation was all wrapped up in that. And when his guitar player in his band one day, because he couldn't ever keep a drummer. The drummer would always be the problem.
Right.
But I was playing drums at that point, and his guitar player said, why don't you just let your son play, And he said, okay. And I played a set that night, and the next week I think I played the whole night, 4 sets of music. And I became the drummer in his band. And like you said, my mom became my agent. And she said, how much you going to pay him? And he said, I'll throw him out $20 or whatever. She said, no. You're going to pay him just like a real drummer, which started my bank account, my savings account. And so, yeah, I mean, that totally set me on my path towards music. And probably in less than a year after I started playing with him, I met my partner, Terry Lewis. And which then changed my life in a whole nother way. So if you think about, just the kind of chronology of things, he totally was my musical foundation. So everything that you hear that I do, at some point, his influence is in there.
Here's a question that I've wanted to ask for a little while. In regards to Terry Lewis. Were you and Terry friends before your dad went to work and didn't come home, or was that after?
We were friends before. So I met Terry, I was 12 turning 13 when I met Terry. I met him a couple of weeks after I turned 13 years old.
Okay.
And we met at a program called Upward Bound. It was on the University of Minnesota campus. We were both junior high schoolers at the time, or middle schoolers, as I guess it's called nowadays. And I remember seeing him sitting on his bed in the dorm, because he stayed in dorms, which was great. And he was playing Kool and the Gang bass parts on this red, black, and green bass. And I remember looking at him, and I was basically an only child. I had older half-brothers and sisters, but they never lived at home when I did. So I was like an only child. And he was like, when I saw him, it was like love at first sight. Because I was like, he was like a big brother. Like he was just somebody I just needed to know. And he felt the same way about me. He saw me playing the piano down in the lunchroom with a bunch of girls around me, allegedly.
Of course.
And he just said, I got to get to know this dude. So that was kind of our meeting. And it was really like love at first sight when we got to know each other. But no, I was still playing with my dad. And so the funny thing was, at the end of that kind of summer in Upward Bound, there was a a summer in dance. Mm-hmm. And so Terry said, let's put a band together and play for the dance. And I said, okay, cool, I'll play the drums. And he said, I already got a drummer. And his drummer was Jelly Bean Johnson, who was the time drummer.
Right.
So he said, you should play keyboards because your dad plays keyboards. I said, okay, cool. We went and stole my dad's organ. He had this Farfisa organ, and we had it at the place that we played on the weekends, and we went in and stole it. I have no idea how we drove there because we didn't have licenses at the time. We were too young. But somebody took us there. We never have quite figured out how that happened. And I stole my dad's organ, and we played this little gig. And that was the first time we ever played together. And and then that weekend after, then I went and played with my dad. So we were still together at that point. And it was probably when he left was probably a couple of years after that.
The reason that I asked that is because every documentation, every interview I've ever listened to, when you mention Terry, it's always you were like, yeah, and Terry was like, no, come on, Jan, let's jam, let's do this, let's come on, let's go do this. You need keyboards. What keyboards you need? I got you. Let's go get keyboards. So I bring that up to say, would you, in some kind of way now, looking back at it, consider Terry giving you the push that your dad might have gave you if he was still constantly in contact with you?
It's an interesting question, and one that I haven't been asked before. I don't remember my dad ever really giving me a push.
Okay.
I think that I think he liked that I played, but I don't remember him ever saying like rah rah, you got to get out there and you got to. I don't remember that with him at all. I just remember we just kind of fell into a natural thing where I just wanted to go everywhere he went, wherever studio he went to, whatever rehearsal he went to, whatever gig he was playing. I just always wanted to be there. So I do remember that part of it. Terry was much more of the gung-ho, you got to do this. Matter of fact, there's a picture in the book of me playing drums with my dad when I'm probably, 7 or 8 years old maybe. And in the picture, there's this telephone. And the telephone, I remember, used to ring every single morning when Terry was trying to get me to join the band, And he would call me every day. This is before cell phones and stuff. He would call me every day, and he'd go, Jam, you got to join the band. And I go, Terry, no, man, at that point I was a DJ. I'd sold all my musical equipment and I was DJing. And he said, man, you're a musician, man, I said, I don't even have my keyboards anymore, Terry. He said, man, I'll get you keyboards, man. What do you need? It was like one of those kinds of things. And he eventually twisted my arm and got me back in the group. And of course the time happened right after that. So Terry was very much the kind of leader. And like I say, when I even first met him, sort of like the big brother that I never had. But I just trusted him. For some reason, he would always have a vision, and I would just go along with it. And it worked really well.
Here's a question I have for the both of you. Because of this book, it is my humblest of opinion that the history of music, the history of black music, really the history of music in its entirety, needs to have either an addendum or be rewritten. Because while no one, Minnesota isn't anywhere anybody ever, Muscle Shoals isn't in Minnesota, right? It's not Memphis. It's not Stax. Stax didn't come from there. Motown didn't come from there. But here we read a book on the contribution of your dad as far back as the 50s, singing a type of music. Playing a type of music that wasn't necessarily indigenous to that particular region of America. So my question is, do you feel that we need to put an addendum in the history of American music? His contribution and Minnesota as a whole needs to be better included.
I think you just outlined my life's work, is to write that addendum.
Say that.
That was going to be next. The addendum is right here. The question is are we going to place it in its proper perspective? But
absolutely. I've done a lot of research into not just Cornbread's story and Jimmy's story, but the history of the Minneapolis sound. And by that I mean not just Prince, but the 4 decades of music performed by black musicians in Minnesota before that, who really laid the groundwork for the sound with jazz and gospel and soul music and R&B. And there's so many stories that were not documented anywhere. They weren't written about in the mainstream newspapers. They weren't talked about in this way that we canonize other artists that come from this place. And I think Prince is such a great entry point for people because he is a global icon, and Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis are a great entry point into that story. But it is an incredibly rich community that they came out of. And I think also because at the time when they came out of Minnesota, the black population was maybe 2-3% of the state. People just assumed that there weren't other black people making music. Right. But it's been such a joy for me to learn about these generations of musicians who really, laid down the groundwork of all of this sound that we call the Minneapolis sound. And I know working with Cornbread, he has so many different bands he's led over time. He was a band leader in the early 50s of a 9-piece orchestra like Duke Ellington. And then he went on to become one of the first rock and rollers in the state of Minnesota, and they opened for Elvis. And then he started, these jazz combos and playing alone at the piano, entertaining people. I mean, he's probably played for hundreds of thousands of people over the last 75 years, but he's done it one room at a time. And to be able to piece together his story and put him in the context of all that came after him, it's very moving for him to finally be acknowledged for that. I know we've had many conversations where he'll hear Jimmy say something about how he influenced him, and he's moved to tears saying, I can't believe I'm part of the Minneapolis sound. You know, it's just never been contextualized in that way before, and I think it's so important.
By the way, there is a book.
Yes.
Talk about your book, because people should know about this book.
My first book came out in 2017, which is how I met Jimmy in the first place, and it's called Got to Be Something Here, The Rise of the Minneapolis Sound. And it starts in the 50s and goes up to the late 70s and traces the origins of this music that I'm talking about.
Wow, phenomenal. I had the opportunity a few years ago to interview a fabulous gentleman named Gary Hines.
Oh.
Right?
Both
Fabulous.
like Gary.
Fabulous gentleman.
Yes.
When that interview finished, I don't know if I felt like I had an uncle.
Yes.
Right? Like,
Yes.
I feel like I'd call him now if I needed to talk to him.
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell me, once everything got together, once you finally got a label for the unfaringly short amount of time that it was utilized, it's almost as though you went back to get people, right? I don't know without you with Terry that there is an Alexander O'Neal in the vein of which we know him. Again, from the area, horribly underrated, does not get the due that he was deserved. And then here comes Sounds of Blackness, where now folks are listening to gospel who otherwise would want nothing to do with gospel. And that's coming from me, who's, obviously a blatant lover of gospel, right? Hymns, from hymns from my grandparents to contemporary with my mother and all those things. So this is a ongoing legacy of yours. What does it mean to you to go back to get individuals who we know are as talented as anybody from any quote-unquote hotbed? But what does it mean to you to go back and get them?
Well, it means a lot. And, in the case of Alexander O'Neal, the story was that Alex was part of Flight Time. He was one of the lead singers in Flight Time. Actually, after Cynthia Johnson, who sang on Funky Town, she was one of the lead singers of Flight Time at one point. And then Alexander O'Neal was the lead singer. But there was a famous dinner that took place where Prince wanted to sign, Morris Day, and he told Morris, put a band together and I'll get you a record deal. And the band Morris came to was our band, was Flight Time. And Alex got in the meeting, and Alex was our lead singer, and Alex, who always talked in the third person, said, Prince, Alexander O'Neal needs some paper. And Prince was like, what are you talking about, man? He said, I need some paper. I need a car. I need a house. This record deal is cool and everything, but, Alexander O'Neal needs some paper. And Prince and Morris walked out. And we're like going, wait a minute. We got a record deal. You just blew the record deal, right? And a few days later, or a week later, whatever, Prince called Terry, and he just said, Alexander O'Neal is out. Jellybean's the drummer. Morris Day's the singer. And meet us for a rehearsal at 10 a.m. tomorrow or whatever. So that was the way it all worked. So I remember we said to Alex, we said, Alex, man, we're going to do this thing, man. It's not going to happen with you. And he said, that's cool, man. Alexander O'Neal, it's all good. Because, Alexander O'Neal, if there's a bear in the woods, and Alexander O'Neal, you better help the bear because Alexander O'Neal don't need no help.
Wow.
Like, okay. And we actually did a publishing company called Help the Bear based on that. But Clarence Avant, who we had met later on, he had sent us an artist, a male artist, to do some songs. And this dude just was not cutting it. He just was not getting it down. And so we said, Clarence, we got this dude up here. Can we put his voice on these records? And he said, yeah, do what you want to do. We said, okay, cool. We went over to the club where Alex was playing, at 1 in the morning. We said, Alex, can you come to the studio and just sing these songs real quick? And he said, cool. And he came over. If You Were Here Tonight was one of the songs. And we literally sent, a cassette to Clarence. And we said, listen to this dude, see what you think. And he called us up and he said, man, who's this dude? And we said, Alexander O'Neill. And Clarence goes, hey, what is he, Irish? And we said, no. I said, no, he's black. What kind of name is O'Neill for a black man? I said, I don't know, Clarence, but, he's good. Clarence said, bring him out. So we flew to L.A. Clarence gave Alexander O'Neill a deal right on the spot. Said, you're the guy. And we made the album. So that was the opportunity to do that. The other example you said was Sounds of Blackness. Sounds of Blackness, we were doing gigs with them back in the Flight Time days. And, back in the 70s, we were doing gigs with them. And we actually, I'll tell you who the A&R person was for Sounds of Blackness was Janet Jackson. We were working on the Rhythm Nation album. And Sounds of Blackness always did like holiday concerts, like Christmas concerts and stuff. And I remember we went to one of the shows and we took her. And, Sounds of Blackness was basically doing all the forms of black music, right? Jazz and funk and blues and everything. And every time they'd go into a different kind of music, Janet would elbow me and go, wow, they're doing jazz now. Oh, man, they're doing like that. And she knew we were starting a label, and she said, you need to sign them to your label. And Terry and I hadn't really thought about it, but we were like, oh, yeah, I guess so. And so that's how they ended up being the first act that we signed. Well, actually, the first act we signed was Mint Condition, actually, because we wanted to sign a band.
Right.
But the first release was Sounds of Blackness, because our theory was, if you're going to build a tall building, first thing you got to do is dig that foundation really deep. And we really thought that Sounds of Blackness should be the foundation of our label, which was Perspective Records. So I think, and the whole idea of doing a record company was simply because we wanted to do things that people weren't doing. We knew that Mint Condition as a band, because bands weren't really in at that point, they weren't going to get a deal. Sounds of Blackness was not going to get a deal. And those were the people we went out and signed because we felt like they needed to have exposure. They needed to have a chance to make records. And, to this day, Optimistic's favorite song that I've ever been associated with. I always say it's God's plan, but God wrote Optimistic and allowed Terry and me to deliver it. That's the way I feel about it.
Alexander O'Neill, Mint Condition, Sounds of Blackness. The group that gave us Tell Me Where Do You Want to Put It?
Oh, Solo.
Solo.
From New York.
Yes. Right there. Those four. There are individuals who go an entire career and don't make one good record for one good group. You've made iconic music. And of course, there's always my favorite. Excuse my bias. Please excuse my bias, sir,
Okay.
for the SOS band.
Oh, I love that.
Just the structure of the SOS band, starting albums with mid-tempo songs and not upper-tempo songs. Like, that is unheard of. It was unheard of before you did it. It was unheard of while you did it. And for most intents and purposes, no one still starts a stream, since we don't technically have albums anymore, with a mid-tempo song. Where did that concept come from?
Okay, well, let me dig into the SOS band a little bit, because there's a lot of pieces here. The origin of that is when Terry and I first came to LA, we were in the Time and we were playing. And I remember when we were done doing the tour, which was the Controversy tour with Prince, and Terry said, I'm going to LA, who wants to come with me? And everybody at that time, this will date this, everybody said, no, man, I'm saving my money for a VCR, because that was the thing to get, a VCR, right? Ooh. And so nobody wanted to come. And then I said, well, I'll go. Terry said, great. And I said, where are we going to stay, Terry? Oh, we'll figure it out. I said, where are we going to get the equipment to do demos and stuff? We'll figure it out. Because everybody was like, why are you going out there? And Terry said, because they need us out there. I was like, okay. So I just blindly followed Terry. I just really always felt that way about him. So we come to town. Leon Silvers III puts us in the studio. He's the first one to give us a chance to just get in the studio and create. We wrote a song called High Hopes for the SOS. But we didn't write it for the SOS band. We just wrote the song. Leon Silvers III heard the song and said, I'm cutting this on SOS band. And we thought, well, that's weird because they got a female singer, but how are you going to do that? So he got Abdul Rauf to sing the song from SOS band. And High Hopes became what back in the day was called a turntable hit, meaning that radio stations loved it, they played it, didn't really sell that well. So Clarence then called us later on and said, I want you guys to do some songs for the SOS band. We said, okay, cool. So on tour now with the 1999 tour with Prince, we had 4 days off in New York. We fly down to Atlanta to record the SOS band. We get caught in a snowstorm down there. And by the way, a snowstorm is, we're talking, we would call it a dusting of snow. Okay? Like you just sweep it off and you don't even need shovels. You just sweep it off. Close the airport down. We missed the next time gig. So Prince had told us not to work with other bands. That was like his thing. Don't work with anybody else. So a couple of weeks later, our picture's in Billboard magazine. He thinks we had gone down to see some girls. He was like, I told you not to go down there and see those girls. A couple of weeks later, we're in Billboard magazine. We're like, oh, man. So we finished the tour. So now we're getting ready to go mix the SOS band song, right? And he calls us to a studio called Sunset Sound. He said, meet me at Sunset Sound at 5 o'clock. So we go over to Sunset Sound, and we're sitting around a table about kind of like we're sitting here now. And he just goes, I told you guys not to produce other bands. And we said, yeah. He said, you produce the SOS band? We said, yeah. He said, so you're fired. I was like, cool. I got up and I walked out. Terry kind of stuck in there a little while and tried to reason with him a little bit. And eventually Terry comes out and kind of looked at each other and we said, well, what do you want to do? We said, well, we'll go to this other studio and mix the SOS band's, record. So we go to a studio called Larrabee Sound. We walk in. The engineer is a guy named Steve Hodge. We had never met Steve before, but in the old days of records, there were liner notes.
Yes.
And Steve Hodge was the engineer on all the Leon Silvers records. Lakeside, Shalimar, Whispers, those are the records. And we were like, we want something that sounds like that. So we walk into the studio. We go, hey, Steve. He goes, hey, nice to meet you guys. I said, nice to meet you. He said, what's wrong? We said, well, we just got fired from the time. And he said, that's too bad. He said, well, I don't think you guys have anything to worry about because this song you got here, this is a smash. He hits play, and the Steve Hodge mix of Just Be Good to Me comes blasting out these huge speakers. And we were like, oh, shit, we good. I think we're good. And that was really the beginning. So when you talk about SOS Band, that was the pivotal point for us where we literally got fired at one studio and went and mixed our first hit, all in an hour period maybe. And, the rest is history, I guess. But that was such a pivotal moment. But also the SOS Band was so nice to let these two guys from Minneapolis go in and actually produce their records. But we were very analytical about it. We kind of knew when they had Take Your Time, Do It Right, which was an amazing record. And the next couple of records didn't really do that well. And we knew the formula. We could tell the ingredients. And so we did a lot of studying. And we were like, if we do a repetitive bass line with a low end that's really cool, but then over the top, we put all these pretty things like glockenspiels, bells, and we do those. And then a repetitive, like, baby, they can do it. Take your time, do it right. If we just do na 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 na, like we were like, it was the formula, but they allowed us to do it. They didn't go like, what y'all don't know what you're doing, because we'd never produced a record before. We didn't know what we were doing, but they allowed us to do it. And like I say, the rest is history. And even Clarence was cool because Clarence, we kept saying, hey, you want us to send you what we're doing? He's like, I'll hear it when it's done. So he's even set a tone with like A&R people. Like whenever we made any other records, they'd be like, hey, can we come hear what you're doing? And be like, nah, Clarence never wanted to hear anything till it was done. So you'll hear it when it's done. So there were so many seeds that got planted back in that first era of music, so to speak. And SOS Band was the big one, and Clarence Avant was a big part, and Leon Silvers III was a big part.
I want to take this moment to say thank you to the both of you for taking some time out when you're running around back and forth to sit and talk with myself and the New York Association of Black Journalists here at DSN and Nexus Studios. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're just checking us out, we are sitting here with Andrea Swensson and of course the iconic Jimmy Jam to talk about Deeper Blues, the life, songs, and salvation of Cornbread Harris, who, if you're just tuning in, happens to be the father of my guest. Taking us to this last question, and this pretty much goes to the both of you again, I want to thank you for your time. I hope that one day, at some point, we could do this again. But my question would be, and it's a different question for each of you, so I'll start with Andrea. Andrea, my question for you is that as you look back on your career and you look at this book, if you could give some words of wisdom to you from 20 years ago,
Oof.
what would you say to her?
Stop beating yourself up. It's going to work out. I think my career has just been such a natural evolution from one thing to the next. I worked in a newspaper, and then I worked at a radio station, and then I started working for Prince's estate after he passed because I had a relationship with him. And everything that comes next is always a surprise, but kind of not really, because I feel like I've been working toward it. And I think when you're young, you have this urgency to everything. Like, I want to be an author. I want to do this. I want to do that. And I want to do it today. And now that I look back, it's like, well, no, it takes a while. Every step matters and is important and is a building block to get to where you go next. But if you have patience and you're just constantly preparing for the next opportunity, I think it can be really powerful. I always remember when Conan O'Brien signed off of his show when he got his show was canceled. And he said, if you work hard and are kind, amazing things can happen. And I wrote that over my desk for years. I looked at that every day. Just work hard and be kind. And amazing things have happened.
Yeah.
My question for you, sir, and kindness is something that walked in the door. You could feel that kindness from the both of you when you walked in the door. So it's no wonder that the success that has been bestowed upon both of you is what it is, because of the kindness, because of the willingness to talk to, individuals that others might say, oh, those are the nobodies. I've watched you on Instagram lives for people I didn't know who in the world they were. And here you are just conversing right away like you've known them for 25, 30 years. So my question to you would be, I'm going to go a different lane.
Okay.
Jimmy, somewhere there is a young man or a young woman dead on similar story as yours, but they haven't gotten to that point where they reached out to that parent that has played a part in their success or their growth exponentially, but from a distance. Presumed absence, but if I'm exhibiting a talent that I know comes from my dad or my mom, they're really not an absent parent. Mm-hmm. They're just physically not here. Mm-hmm. What would you say to that young individual who's sitting there wondering, should I, shouldn't I? Will it affect my creative process? What would you say to them?
Well, it's interesting because I think I would start by saying that probably 30 years ago, I would have been caught up, like if I had been with Cornbread 30 years ago, I would have been caught up in having to have an explanation of why you left, and it would have been a bunch of questions and a bunch of interrogation and things like that. I think sometimes, I don't know, maturity or old age or whatever you want to term it.
Maturity.
Okay. I just think that my thing was when I met him, it wasn't about me. It was about lifting the weight off of him of guilt. If he felt any guilt, I wanted to lift that from him. And I also wanted to make it apparent to him of how influential he was in my life. But I was able to do that in my 60s because I was mature enough to recognize that that was what was the important thing. When I was 30, I had a different sense of what was important. So I think everybody has to walk their own path and figure it out their own way and do it in their own time. Mm-hmm. But I think you have to be, I was given advice, it would be open to those things happening. Because a lot of times people feel like, well, I'm never going to something, that ain't going to happen, whatever. And they carry around grudges, and grudges are heavy. Grudges are really heavy. And you're the only one that knows you're carrying them around, by the way. The person you're holding a grudge against, they don't know you're holding a grudge against them. They don't know. So I think I tried to get rid of a lot of the negative energy, and people talk about that I've lost a lot of weight. Well, I did that for health reasons because I wanted to be around to see grandkids when I had them. but also because I felt like I got rid of the weight of negativity, of grudges, of blame, of criticizing people. That's the weight I got rid of, was all that weight. Right. And so I would just say be open to, God's plan. It all happens how it's supposed to happen. Andrea talked about, 20 years ago what she would have told herself, but the word she used in there was preparing. And when people ever ask me advice about anything, I always say, there's a thing where people say, I'm just waiting for somebody to give me a break. I'm just waiting for something, blah, blah, blah. And I always say, substitute the word waiting, get rid of that word. Put the word preparing. I'm preparing for somebody to give me a break. I'm preparing for my chance. I'm preparing, right? And if you do that, then when that opportunity comes, you recognize it and you're ready to act on it because you're prepared for it. So that's my overall advice, just in life and in everything. Prepare for it. And I feel like at some point in my life, by raising my kids and teaching them the lessons and passing them the lessons that Cornbread taught me as a kid, I just think that I was preparing them for life, but I was also preparing myself to have this moment when Andrea came in my life, when other people came in my life that were kind of guiding me back towards my dad. I didn't fight it. I wasn't like, resentful or anything like that. I just was like, okay, let this happen, because I was prepared for it. I realized I'd prepared for it with all the things I had done leading up to it and getting to know Andrea and all of those little things. So I guess that would be my advice to people, is just be open to recognize the blessings when they're coming to you. Because God's always whispering to you. It's just you're not listening a lot of times. And now I just listen. Like God whispers to me, but it sounds like he's yelling at me. Like it's like, okay. Like I hear it, And I just want to also say, because one of the other things you mentioned was kind. I just think that kindness is something that is so needed right now across the board. I think I was talking earlier with somebody today, and we were talking about how I think social media and different things happen where I think people are looking to wake up and be offended by something. Like almost you wake up and you're almost looking for who said this wrong or who did that wrong or whatever. And it's so much judgment in that. I'm not into that. I'm into positive energy, and I'm into I DM people all the time, and I just go, hey, I love your song, or I love your whatever. And they go, Jimmy Jam? It's like, yeah. But I do that all the time. I just think it's important to let people know when they're doing something good, because Lord knows there's tons of people that'll let you know when you're messing up or when they think you're messing up. I just want to be on the other side of that. And if I can then convince, if somebody uses me as an example and then can do that, then I think we can at least balance it a little bit, where people at least are hearing some good feedback or some encouragement. It doesn't cost anything to do that. It's to me, it's energizing to do that. So that's the thing I wake up every day and I think, thank you, God, for another chance. Another chance.
Andrea Swensson, James Jimmy Jam Harris, thank you very much on behalf of the New York Association of Black Journalists for your time today.
Thank you for allowing us this beautiful platform to talk about these things. And, I always tell people, it's nice that we can make the records or that we can tell the story, but somebody has to deliver them in order for them to mean something. So thank you guys for delivering our story today.
Thank you. This has been a very meaningful conversation. Appreciate it.
Thank you.